The destruction of the Twin Towers at the World Trade Center changed the course of history, becoming a new dawn of American foreign policy that officially, or at least immediately within the public's perception, was brought about by terrorist actions having taken place outside the state of New York on the morning of September 11, 2001, beginning at 3 U.S. airports: Boston Logan in Massachusetts, Dulles International in Virginia, and Newark Airport in New Jersey. Although another major target was successfully struck, the loss of life between building occupants and passengers in total was immense, as were the unanswered questions from the victims' families and general public. But the real story of 9/11, that being the targeting of the World Trade Center, began at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York exactly 9 years and 10 days earlier, on September 1st, 1992, when two Middle Eastern men trained with handling explosives arrived from Pakistan.
Let's go take a look back. Mary Murphy looked at the bombing in 1993 and other acts of terrorism since. Here's her report.
February 26, 1993 is the day foreign terror blasted New York into a new reality.
I never want to go through that again. I'll never go in that building. It was horrible, the feeling not getting out, not being able to get out. You felt smothered.
Within a week, the FBI had the undercarriage of the Ryder rental van that carried the bomb and its first suspect in New Jersey, a Palestinian named Mohamed Salameh, and then another Palestinian, chemical engineer Nadel Ayad, whose voice was captured on a message left for the Daily News.
This is the Liberation Army. We conducted the explosion at the World Trade Center.
The FBI discovered this ripped photo of Ayad in a garbage can outside his New Jersey home, the accused terrorist posing with a grenade beneath a Palestinian flag. The feds also found him posing with Egyptian radical Sayyid Nosair at Attica State Prison in New York before the Trade Center bombing, but after Nosair had been convicted of gun charges in the fatal shooting of Rabbi Meir Kahane. Within months, the group would be linked to a much larger conspiracy. A blind Egyptian sheikh named Omar Abdel Rahman finally surrenders from a Brooklyn mosque after the FBI discovers a bomb factory at a Jamaica Queens warehouse. Surveillance tape showing a half-dozen men delivering steel drums to the site.
As we entered the bomb factory, the 5 subjects were actually mixing the witch's brew.
The sheikh was later convicted of plotting attacks on the UN and bridges and tunnels linking New York and New Jersey. This evidence tape shows ringleader Sadiq Ali doing a run-through in the Lincoln and Holland tunnels, even scoping out areas where security personnel are stationed. Within a year of the sheikh's life sentence, 2 letter bombs arrived at the United Nations, not long after others had turned up at a federal prison housing the sheikh.
All were postmarked from Alexandria, Egypt.
We learned we were vulnerable then. We were vulnerable again when they hit Oklahoma City. And again, America and humanity is vulnerable to terrorism as we lost the World Trade Center today and an untold number of lives as well.
What has our great democratic government done here? What has our media done here? You know, the one story about 911, there's a lot of stuff you can hear about 911, but all you need to know about 911 and the fact that what we've been told is a lie is the personal testimony of William Rodriguez. Absolutely. I've heard all the stories. I've been on all the websites. I've read the books. I've seen the videos. I'm here to tell you his personal testimony, his singular experience proves that it's a lie.
Our office was on the B1 level. As I was talking to a supervisor at 846, and all of a sudden we hear, boom! An explosion so hard that pushed us upwards. And it came from the basement between the B2 level and the B3 level. And when I went to verbalize, we hear the impact of the plane on the top. 2 different events. That was the plane on the top. There was an explosion prior the plane hitting the building. A person comes running into the office saying, explosion, explosion, explosion. His hands extended, and all the skin pulled from under his armpits on both arms, hanging on the top of the fingertips. Imagine you take off a glove and you let it hanging. And I didn't know what it was. It was his skin. And when I said, what happened? He was in a shock. And what appeared to be a red shirt Then we realized, as he got closer, is that he was drenched in blood. This guy was burned 33% of his body, 33%. And as he got closer and everybody realized that, horror, everybody screaming, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And as he got closer, we realized all this part of his face was hanging. And I say, don't move, because I was going to go inside the office to pick up the phone to call the emergency medical unit that was located on the South Tower. The North Tower and the South Tower connected through the basement. There was like a big loop, but they connected through the basement. And they were very efficient to get there. So I went to tell them that I have an injured person in the office. When I went to pick up the phone, another explosion. Very loud, very powerful. The floor started moving below us, and everybody started running to the door frames because they thought it was an earthquake. And they're all piling up by the door frames, all of them. And when I see that, my supervisor, Anthony Saltalamaica, started screaming, it's a bomb, it's a bomb. But why is he saying that? Because he survived the bomb of 1993. A van was placed on our side of the building, same basement, way below, and it blew up. And it killed 6 people, 1,000 people were injured. And of course, he is acting on his memory.
And ultimately, with William himself both surviving the first and last attack on the Twin Towers, brave he has been for going public with his story surviving the second attack. He's very fortunate given the number of people who were at the World Trade Center in 2001 and did die, but had already survived the 1993 bombing like he had, as he is now a survivor twice. But when it comes to what happened 8.5 years earlier with the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, it's now been a long-held belief by conspiracy theorists and the 9/11 Truth Movement that the first attack was carried out by the FBI, or in part by the CIA or some rogue element in the US government, rather than foreign members of the Blind Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman's inner circle, Ramzi Yousef, or Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, as who authorities first essentially blamed it on, which eventually brought into the loose umbrella term that's now known as Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, it's the FBI that's the big problem. For instance, the court has found that the FBI provided the live bomb. It's a matter of court record for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, for instance. And we all know that they, set up basically victims, Muslims, to infiltrate these terrorist cells that they created in the first place.
But let's be honest, most that come from the school of thought in which the US government or the FBI did the 1993 bombing basically heard it from the likes of this guy.
But I made a film about this. I've been covering this since right after it happened. That's why I got on air. It took me 2 years to get on air. I got on air in 95.
The FBI actually carried out the attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. They actually hired a retired 43-year-old former Egyptian army officer, Emad Salem, and paid him $1 million and gave him real explosives, a detonator, and told him to build a bomb and to give it to the foolish people that he was controlling to allow them to attack the World Trade Center complex. Mr. Salam was not as ruthless and sociopathic as the FBI and their globalist controllers. There was only one problem. The drivers of the truck didn't park it up against the main support column as they had been ordered to do by Mr. Salam and the FBI, and the FBI, and the FBI.
Couldn't believe the FBI would basically tell him to build the bomb, give him real detonators, and then tell him let it go forward. That was a game changer for me, because you're one of the only people on the inside to ever get out alive who exposes a false flag, false flag, false flag.
So was the 1993 World Trade Center bombing actually carried out by the FBI in a government false flag, as Alex Jones and others state, like he did 8.5 years later with 9/11? Or plainly put, as an American conspiracy? Most of you who come across this channel and film already have some grasp to the alternative 9/11 conspiracy theories out there under the 9/11 Truth banner, especially with the infamous story of the dancing Israelis, and much evidence has come out since underlining theirs and other Mossad operatives possibly involved in the September 11th attacks.
Our purpose was to document the event.
But was there also Mossad involvement in the 1993 bombing too? And if there was Mossad involvement in 1993, would one's overall belief on who was alternatively responsible for the 9/11 attacks had been a drastically different conclusion in accusation, knowing that Israeli intelligence was already involved the first time on targeting the Twin Towers? Especially since it's been practically known before mainline success that Alex Jones was once considered the leader of the 9/11 truth movement? Or was the Mossad only involved in 9/11, and the 1993 bombing was a legitimate radical Islamic attack, as what's also retroactively covered within the 9/11 Commission report, as 1993 is also primarily known to be the first Islamic attack in the US. Yet why till this day, even when Osama bin Laden was alive, was he still wanted and charged by the FBI for the East Africa embassy bombings and other terrorist attacks throughout the world, but not specifically for the attacks of September 11th? For which, if the FBI wasn't able to prove bin Laden was behind the 9/11 attacks and subsequent destruction of the World Trade Center, then who was responsible for targeting the World Trade Center the first time in 1993? And speaking of, why also on 9/11 did WPIX News Channel 11 and other local New York press also seem persistent in pushing a Palestinian narrative added with Egyptian complicity in the 1993 bombing? How and when did radical Islam begin? Reality couldn't be further from the truth, when fundamentalist figures that influenced radical Islamic terrorism are not only directly connected to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, but are inherently connected to what was later known as Al-Qaeda. But like 9/11, 1993 does not rule out any possible Israeli or Western involvements. Aside from mainstream history documentaries, as well as the 1997 HBO movie Path to Paradise, and 2006 controversial ABC movie series Path to 9/11, that are somewhat helpful in familiarity with the before and after 93 bombing story, unfortunately for alternative history, there really isn't a full-length documentary film specific on the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, released independently or distributed commercially, that provides a different narrative given with some of the holes of the story that we're already implying, in contrast to what's more commonly known as far as problems occurring ahead in 9/11. Besides the recent edition with History Channel's Road to 9/11, all that exists mainly covers Ramzi Yousef, and alternatively a few obscure clips featured on early Alex Jones documentaries and throughout so-called research from the late Bill Cooper and Ted Gunderson, all combining the same FBI-CIA shadow government narrative.
Look, the CIA has done in this country, what they've done to us is unbelievable. Look at the terrorist acts that have occurred. The CIA behind most, if not all of them. We had the Marine barracks. We had our embassy in Kenya. We had Pan Am 103. We had the USS Cole. We had Oklahoma City. We had the World Trade Center in 1993.
That helped the terrorists blow up the World Trade Center the first time. They built the bomb. They got the driver's license.
However, this film is a compendium using official and independent narratives as well as news archives, mostly combined and edited in a manner allowing each sampled film and documentary source to tell part of the story, but at the same time, still challenging the official story of the 1993 bombing and also those popular alternative conspiracy theories, whether it's through officials, researchers, witnesses, or perpetrators involved in the stories leading up and following 1993. And to also keep it captivating, this film will also be accompanied by sampling dramatized actors from feature movies. This is The Hidden Path to 9/11, World Trade Center bombing of 1993, false flag terrorism, cover-ups, and missing links.
The story could truly begin with the 1948 Arab-Israeli War of Independence for the State of Israel, or even before it. But for all intents and purposes, to demonstrate U.S. influence in the Middle East and what Americans will come to know as Islamic terrorism, in a twisted, comparing fashion of both opposing hardline views between the neoconservatives and Muslim fundamentalists, we shall follow the introductory footsteps of BBC documentarian Adam Curtis and begin the story in 1948, not in the Middle East, but instead in the United States within a small town known as Greeley, Colorado. Sayyid Qutb, a middle-aged school instructor from Egypt, arrives in the summer and enrolls in the local state college, and throughout that year, he traveled across America and became increasingly disenchanted with its decadence, anti-consumerism, as he saw it as a weak, immoral, and corrupt society. In 1950, Qutb moved back to Egypt and became politically active, joining the Muslim Brotherhood, a transnational Sunni Islamist organization founded in Egypt in 1928 by an Islamic scholar and schoolteacher, Hassan al-Banna, who was gunned down in Cairo in 1949. The agenda behind the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is to make Islam a major role in governing Egyptian society. As Qutb has returned to Egypt, he had become politically active, but by July 23, 1952, King Farouk was toppled in a bloodless coup d'etat, becoming arrested by the Free Officers Movement, a group of army officers led by Mohammed Naguib and Gamal Abdel Nasser, who set abolish the constitutional monarchy and aristocracy of Egypt and Sudan, establishing a republic, eventually rooting out the British occupation of the country. Following the coup d'etat, Naguib went on to serve as the head of the Revolutionary Command Council, the prime minister and first president of Egypt, successfully negotiating the independence of Sudan and the withdrawal of all British military personnel from Egypt. His tenure as president came to an end in November 1954 due to disagreements with other members of the Free Officers, particularly with Nasser, who would go on to succeed him as president. The Muslim Brotherhood welcomed the coup d'etat as Nasser used to go to the house of Sayyid Qutb and ask him for ideas about the revolution, enjoying a close relationship with the movement. But many members of the Brotherhood expected Nasser to establish an Islamic government. However, the cooperation between the Brotherhood and Free Officers, which marked the revolution's success, soon soured as Nasser made it clear that the new Egypt will be a nationalist secular society that emulates Western morals, which was incompatible with the Islamism of the Brotherhood. He ended up forging an alliance with the United States and welcoming the CIA to come to Egypt and organize security agencies for the new government. Nasser had secretly set up an organization that would sufficiently oppose the Muslim Brotherhood once he came to power. At this time, Qutb did not realize Nasser's alternate plans and would continue to meet with him, sometimes for 12 hours a day, to discuss a post-monarchical Egypt. Once Qutb realized that Nasser had taken advantage of the secrecy between the Free Officers and the Brotherhood, he promptly quit. Nasser then tried to persuade Qutb by offering him any position he wanted in Egypt except kingship. Qutb refused every offer, having understood the reality of Nasser's plans. Upset that Nasser would not enforce a government based on Islamic ideology, Qutb and other Brotherhood members plotted to assassinate him in 1954. The attempt was foiled, Qutb was jailed soon afterwards. The government used the incident to justify a crackdown on various members of the Brotherhood for their vocal opposition toward the Nasser administration. During his first 3 years in prison, conditions were bad and Qutb was tortured. In later years, he was allowed more mobility, including the opportunity to write, which included a series of books, some secretly in prison, which were then smuggled out. Qutb was let out of prison in May 1964 at the behest of the president of Iraq, Abdul Salim Arif, for only 8 months before being rearrested on August 9, 1965. Qutb had called upon the revolutionary vanguard to rise up against the leaders. He was accused of plotting to overthrow the state and subjected to what some consider a show trial. The trial culminated in a death sentence for Qutb and 6 other members of the Brotherhood. He was sentenced to death for his part in the conspiracy to assassinate the president and other Egyptian officials and personalities, though he was not the instigator or leader of the actual plot. On August 29, 1966, he was executed by hanging. Sometime that same year, Gamal Abdel Nasser publicly laughed at the Muslim Brotherhood for suggesting in 1953 that all women should be required to wear the hijab and that Islamic law should be enforced across the country.
وقابلت المرشد العام للإخوان المسلمين وقعد وطلب مطالب. طلب إيه؟ أول حاجة قال لي يجب أن تقيم الحجاب في مصر وتخلي كل واحدة تمشي في الشارع تلبس طرحة. كل واحدة تمشي.
But at the same time, a blind Egyptian cleric who had been a follower of Qutb began preaching against the secular regime of President Nasser. His name is Omar Abdel Rahman, and he will become known as the Blind Sheikh, the accused mentor and spiritual guidance behind the first attack on the Twin Towers, for which we will be focusing on ahead. Another figure continuing to spread Qutb's message as a schoolboy in the beginning, after his execution, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, who also became an intricate part of the same Egyptian Islamic Jihad group, formerly known as al-Jihad, as the Sheik Omar Abdel Rahman, and he will later become his mentor to a Saudi, Osama bin Laden. But the following year, after Qutb's execution, Nasser had faced defeat as the Six-Day War in 1967 broke out as an armed conflict fought from 5th to 10th of June between Israel and a coalition of Arab states, primarily comprising Jordan, Syria, and Egypt, then known as the United Arab Republic. Israel launched a series of airstrikes, first against Egyptian airfields, initially claiming that it had been attacked by Egypt, but later stating that the airstrikes were preemptive. The question of which side caused the war remains one of a number of controversies relating to the conflict. Egypt and Jordan agreed to a ceasefire on the 8th June, and Syria agreed on the 9th. A ceasefire was signed with Israel on June 11. In the aftermath of the war, Israel crippled the entirety of Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordan militaries. The war saw over 20,000 Arab troops killed, mostly Egyptians, while Israel lost fewer than 1,000. It was a crushing blow for Nasser and the country of Egypt, as well as Arab nationalism. But on the side of the Palestinians, it was also a crushing blow for who will become the father of modern jihad, the founding ideologist or demagogue for Hamas, Abdullah Yusuf Azzam, who as a child pushed out of his hometown by Israel during this Six-Day War. He will become the primary teacher and mentor of Osama bin Laden and developer of al-Qaeda as a militant movement. In the mid-1950s, Azzam joined the Muslim Brotherhood after being influenced by the writings of Hassan al-Banna, Sayyid Qutb, and other members locally. He was eventually introduced to many of the Brotherhood's leaders in Palestine, becoming further interested in Islamic studies, eventually attending colleges and universities throughout Palestine, Jordan, and Syria for the next several years after. Azzam graduated in highest honors and receiving a Bachelor of Arts in Sharia in 1966. Thereafter, he returned to the West Bank, where he taught and preached in the region around the village of Silat al-Harithiyah. After the Six-Day War in 1967 ended with the Israeli military occupation of the West Bank, Azzam and his family left the West Bank and followed the Palestinian exodus to Jordan. After that, Azzam himself eventually ended up in Egypt and continued his studies at the prestigious Al-Azhar University, getting a PhD in principles of Islamic jurisprudence in 1973, while being acquainted with the ideas of Sayyid Qutb. He completed his 600-page doctoral thesis in around 16 months. But coming back to President Nasser, dealing with the nationalist humiliation and disgrace losing in the Six-Day War, Nasser appeared on television on June 9th to inform Egypt's citizens of their country's defeat and announced his resignation. Later that day, he ceded all presidential powers to his then vice president, who had no prior information of this decision and refused to accept the post. But hundreds of thousands of sympathizers poured into the streets in mass demonstrations throughout Egypt and across the Arab world, rejecting his resignation, chanting, "We are your soldiers, Gamal." Nasser retracted his decision the next day. Known as a chain smoker to work long hours and diagnosed with diabetes, Nasser had already suffered from a major heart attack in 1966 and had a second one in 1969, putting him in bed rest for 6 weeks. But on September 28, 1970, after an emergency Arab League summit in Cairo had closed, Nasser suffered a final and fatal heart attack and died several hours later at age 52. Following the announcement of Nasser's death, most Arabs were in a state of shock. Nasser's funeral procession through Cairo on October 1st was attended by at least 5 million mourners. King Hussein of Jordan and Yasser Arafat of the PLO cried openly, and President Muammar Gaddafi of Libya fainted from emotional distress twice. Nasser was succeeded by Vice President Anwar Sadat, who was at his deathbed. Sadat proceeded in ruling Egypt with the same defiance towards Israel as Nasser. Within the first 2 years, he had expelled Soviet officials from the country and was asked if that would induce the United States to come around to a more favorable view of Cairo's position in the Middle East dispute.
I think they will not come except when they find that their interests here in the area are going to be damaged. And we shall do our best to damage the American interests here in the area. I mean, very simply, that Israel receives even the loaf of bread from America. From the loaf of bread to the phantom, they receive from America as checks. Every check, 300 million, 500 million, 70 million, 100 million, so and so. Well, from where did America get this money? America gets this money from all parts of the world, and mainly from the Arab world, from their interests here in oil in our area here. So they are taking our money and they are providing our enemy with it. That's what I wanted to tell my brothers, the Arab leaders and the Arab people. We must not leave America, take their money and give it to Israel to kill our children and kill our laborers and kill our people and destroy our cities like Suez and Ismailia and all these places.
عايزها بالشوكولاتة ولا فراولة ولا فانيليا؟ آيس كريم دوسي أحسن آيس كريم في الدنيا، جاي من كاليفورنيا جري 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 عشانها.
But by the late 1970s, Egypt had been transformed. It had become a modern, westernized state with a prosperous middle class benefiting from a flood of Western capital that was being invested in the country. The government was controlled by a small group of millionaires who were backed by Western banks. The banks had been let in by what Sadat called the open door policy, but he denied any corruption to the West, as Egyptians knew this was a lie.
Who has benefited now from the open door policy? The taxi drivers, the laborers. All those has benefited from the open door policy. It is not like they say that there are millionaires here and so. No, not at all. This is pure black propaganda from the side of the Soviet Union and his agents here in the country.
In 1976, Henry Kissinger had persuaded Sadat to begin peace negotiations with the Israelis as part of his global attempt to create balance and stability in the Middle East. For Kissinger, a ruthless pragmatist and war criminal, religious divisions and hatreds were irrelevant. The following year, in 1977, Sadat flew to Jerusalem to start the peace process. To the West, it was a heroic act, but to the Islamists, especially those of Islamic Jihad, it was a complete betrayal. The following year, in 1978, the Iranian Revolution was beginning, motivated by supporters of the Ayatollah Khomeini, although Shiite, had put forth the idea of an Islamic state remarkably similar, if not inspired, by Qutb's ideas. Through a series of events that year up till 1979, which included hostage-taking at the U.S. Embassy, Iranian President Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, most commonly known as the Shah, was cast into exile.
You sound very dissatisfied with what's happening in Iran now.
Not more than dissatisfied. This is disgraceful, really. I was a Secretary General of the Muslim Congress at one time. This, putting the name Islamic Revolution is a crime against Islam in the first hand.
And President Sadat, do you expect that the Shah will accept the invitation? It seems like a good solution right now.
Quote me, my aeroplane is ready to bring him here, any moment.
Khomeini had inspired an uprising against the Shah of Iran, who was another leader who had allowed Western banks to corrupt his country. In early 1979, the Shah was expelled from Iran, and after temporarily living in exile in Morocco, Bahamas, and Mexico, while also battling his illness of splenomegaly, for which he was diagnosed in 1974, the Shah eventually returned to Egypt, where he died on July 27, 1980, with a bag of Iranian soil that he kept under his deathbed. Sadat gave the Shah a state funeral. But by the end result of the Iranian Revolution and subsequent expelling the Shah, the Khomeini showed the Islamists by example that the dream of creating an Islamic state was possible. And at the end of 1980, a number of other followers of Qutb who had formed cells in Egypt and came together and created an organization they called Islamic Jihad. Its leader was a man named Mohamed Abdel Salam Faraj, who had argued that they should kill Sadat in a spectacular way that would traumatize the masses. This would later play out the following year, as just before that, a military coup against the Sadat regime in June of 1981 had failed, for which Sadat ordered a major crackdown that resulted in the arrest of numerous opposition figures who had motivated the Islamists even more. But by October that year, the annual victory parade held in Cairo to celebrate Egypt's crossing of the Suez Canal had placed the plan to kill Sadat into fruition. Those who carried out the assassination were a group of army officers led by Khalid al-Islambuli, who were part of Islamic Jihad. Once his platoon, containing 3 heavy trucks towing M46 field artillery guns, began to approach the president's platform, Islambuli, along with 3 other gunmen, left from their truck and ran towards the stand, lobbing grenades toward where the president was standing with other Egyptian officials. Sadat was killed. Vice President Hosni Mubarak and 27 others were injured. 10 people were killed in total, including foreign dignitaries. One of the gunmen died, but the remaining conspirators were immediately arrested after successfully fleeing the scene, and the regime launched a massive manhunt for those behind the plot and its associates.
Sadat's murderer is arrested on sight. He is a lieutenant in the Egyptian army. Yet the incident results in over 300 Islamists being put in jail. Behind bars are the future leaders of Islamist organizations, still active around the world today. The massive presence of the International Press Corps will give them an exceptional platform to speak from, starting with their self-proclaimed spokesman, Ayman al-Zawahiri.
This is our word by Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. Now we want to speak to the whole world. Who are we? Who are we? Why did they bring us here? And what we want to say? About the first question, we are Muslims. We are Muslims who believed in their religion, in its broad meaning, as both an ideology and practice. We believed in our religion, both as an ideology and practice, and hence we tried our best to establish this Islamic state and Islamic society. La ilaha illallah! La ilaha illallah!
With the peace agreement, it was a fundamental realignment in that we are now going to accept Israel's right to exist. We're now going to have a normal relationship with Israel. There was a segment of die-hard Islamists who just couldn't accept that.
It's generally thought that the Blind Sheikh issued the fatwa that became Sadat's death sentence. But before the trials and revelations, U.S. media was already presenting a cast of characters being behind the Sadat assassination.
It's a question that is haunting U.S. intelligence officials. Sadat's killers, they believe, were discontented Egyptians with obvious help from supporters in the military. But those Egyptians may have had foreign help. A prime Egyptian suspect is a man named Sayyid Eddin al-Shazli, a former Egyptian chief of staff of the military, who in 1978 established an anti-Sadat front based in Syria, a group which is in fact one of the 2 claiming to have arranged for the murder. The Shazli group has backing from Libya's Colonel Gaddafi, a sworn enemy of Sadat, as well as from Yasser Arafat of the Palestine Liberation Organization, and from Syria's President Assad. Another suspect is a man named Abdel Salam Zayat, a former deputy prime minister arrested among 1,500 others during Sadat's recent crackdown on dissent. Egypt's government newspapers said Zayat was a Soviet agent of the KGB who had recruited a group of Egyptians, codenamed the Swamp, to bring down the Sadat regime at any price. In the coming days, U.S. intelligence will prepare an assessment for President Reagan on what evidence there is of Russian or Libyan or other outside involvement. That assessment could affect future U.S. foreign policy dramatically. But officials stress Sadat's courage earned him many enemies. We may never know for sure who ordered his death.
Following the trials, the assassination squad was led by Lieutenant Islambuli and Faraj, were tried, found guilty, sentenced to death by execution of firing squad in April 1982. For those who did not receive the death sentences, the remaining suspected dissidents had their time served and were released from prison by 1984, as was the case of Ayman al-Zawahiri. Several years before all of this, in December 1979, over 3,000 miles away from Egypt, in the Islamic country of Afghanistan, the Soviet Union invaded. Sheikh Abdullah Azzam, who's now an imam at King Abdul's University in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and issues a fatwa calling on all Muslims to come to Afghanistan's defense. Azzam had left Egypt, where he studied and taught at the Al-Azhar University from 1970 to 1973, where he obtained a PhD in Islamic jurisprudence, and then moved on to Jordan, where he taught at the University of Jordan in Amman, while lecturing at Abdul Aziz University in Saudi Arabia. He was offered a teaching position at King Abdul Aziz University in the spring semester of 1981, He then heard about the conflict in Afghanistan and was invited to Peshawar shortly after. More than anyone, it is Azzam who inspired Muslims, including the former student from the university, Osama bin Laden, to head to Afghanistan after 1981, who also saw this as an opportunity to profit by using his own money and machinery from his family's own construction company to help the resistance in the Soviet-Afghan War. And for the United States, as a Cold War move to contain Soviet influence, the CIA under President Ronald Reagan funnels $3 billion to Muslim fighters repelling the Soviet invasion, who will famously become known as the Mujahedeen, for which on March 10, 1982, Reagan proclaimed it to be Afghanistan Day, dedicating the space shuttle launch to the Afghan Mujahedeen fighters.
I am dedicating on behalf of the American people the March 22nd launch of the Columbia to the people of Afghanistan.
Huzaifa is the son of Abdullah Azzam, recalled how he watched his father take the young Osama bin Laden under his wing.
My father saw in this movement a hope of bringing the Muslim world to the power again. I have lived with Osama bin Laden for more than 12 years, very close to him. At that time, Osama met my father as a teacher in the university.
An Algerian by the name of Abdullah Anas was studying to become an imam in his home country, where he heeded Azzam's call to jihad, arriving in Afghanistan in 1983 and eventually marrying one of his daughters, becoming a future son-in-law.
I was one of the the founders of the Services Bureau with Sheikh Abdullah Azzam, and in the same late 84, Osama bin Laden joined us as a founder also in the Services Bureau. He was from a rich family, and he was able to spend all the expenditure of the office. When you talk about Zawahiri, it's another case. Zawahiri, when he came to Afghanistan, he came with his own idea from a struggle and rivalry between Jama'at al-Jihad, his jihadi group in Egypt, and Muslim Brotherhood. So they hate each other. So when he was released from jail and he came to Peshawar, he wasn't part of Services Bureau. He wasn't part with Sheikh Abdullah Azzam and bin Laden and us. His priority, how to protect people here not to follow the Muslim Brotherhood. And that as a consequence, not to follow Abdullah Azzam, because automatically he will lead them to Muslim Brotherhood. This is just what he was in his mind. It's not true. But I think he was completely paranoid by what happened to Egypt, between him, rivalry between Muslim Brotherhood and the jihadi group. And he brought that struggle to Peshawar, which doesn't exist.
By this time in 1984, Azzam is now in Peshawar on the Afghanistan border, where he runs a charity for Afghan refugees while also organizing Muslim recruits eager to join the battle against the Soviets. Their recruitment efforts include a monthly magazine, Al-Jihad.
If we send the Al-Jihad magazine, spread it to the universities of United States or the Islamic centers, because it was a resource of helping money for Afghanistan. But the main one was in the Brooklyn.
Azzam would eventually take a break from the war in 1988, touring the United States, preaching at the Al-Khifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn and other recruitment facilities throughout the states, raising money and preaching jihad.
Oh, brothers, after Afghanistan, nothing in the world is impossible for us anymore. There are no superpowers or mini-powers. What matters is the willpower that springs from our religious belief. The world today is arbitrarily ruled by Jews and Christians. The Americans, the British, and others. And behind them, the fingers of international Jewry with their wealth and their women and their media.
The Al-Khifa Refugee Center, also known as the Maktab al-Khidmat, also known as the Afghan Services Bureau, set up an elaborate support and recruitment network coast to coast with branches in more than 38 American cities, originally starting in Phoenix, Arizona. These centers became clearinghouses and recruiting offices to support the jihad in Afghanistan and eventually around the world.
And they were working legally. Their job only is to gather the funds and to get the supports from the people living in the state.
But in the early coming year that followed the Soviets' withdrawal of Afghanistan, marking what will become the end of the Soviet-Afghan War, consequently, the Soviet Union disintegrating as the world enters the post-Cold War era, with East and West Germany unification beginning as the wall collapses and as the Baltic states break up and what is described as the revolutions of 1989. But Afghanistan rapidly sinks into civil war and utter chaos as the United States begins to withdraw its support with the Mujahedeen since Soviet-Afghan War has ended, as the unintended consequence of blowback will eventually arise years later.
By the 89, 90, the number reached maybe 4,000 Arabs and Muslims. So it goes up. Until that time, till 88, Osama bin Laden and Sheikh Abdullah Azzam and all of us, as a former founders of Services Bureau, we worked together. But something, Osama split himself to us in late 88, and he joined a group called Jama'atul Jihad, Jihadi group, Egyptians, and they were there, some names like Zawahiri, like somebody called Sayyid Imam, Abul Fadl, and a group. They were not part of jihad in Afghanistan. They were just part in Peshawar for their own agenda. No one knows because they were very minority. No one knows what they are doing there. And they start working, and then they joined to Osama bin Laden. They became a group, and later on they called what we know today Al-Qaeda.
But in early 1989, an attempt on Azzam's life failed when a lethal amount of TNT explosive placed beneath the pulpit from which he delivered the sermon every Friday failed to detonate. It was said that if the bomb exploded, it would have destroyed the mosque and killed everybody inside it. But his fate would soon catch up to him by November 1989, as Abdullah Azzam was driving to a mosque in Peshawar, Pakistan, with two of his sons. A car bomb explodes, killing them instantly. The murder was never solved, but his death made him a martyr to radical Muslims around the world. With Azzam gone, bin Laden, who had already split from the Maktab al-Kidmat, returning home to Saudi Arabia, hailed as a hero after the war, eventually reorganizes the jihad network around him. And that's how the story goes up to 1990. As far as Sayyid Qutb disciples, Ayman al-Zawahiri and Osama bin Laden, who eventually pair up at the hip. But as far as the path taken with Qutb disciple Sheik Abdel Rahman, that becomes a whole different story.
Sheik Abdel Rahman is a rather intriguing individual. He became blind as a child because of juvenile diabetes, and yet had great charismatic power, not despite this, but in part because of this. He was tortured for an extensive period of time, about 3 years, to reveal his role in setting the emotional climate that led to the assassination of Sadat. He ultimately was not convicted of this, in part because of his blindness. How can one convict a man just because of words?
Abdul Rahman was born on May 3rd, 1938, in the city of Al-Gamaliya, Egypt. He lost his eyesight when he was 10 months old. He studied a Braille version of the Quran as a child and had it memorized by age 11 and was sent to an Islamic boarding school. Excelling there, and his academic achievements allowed him to enter Cairo's University's School of Theology and later at the prestigious University of Al-Azhar. Abdul Rahman earned degrees in Islamic jurisprudence. He developed an interest in the works of Ibn Taymiyyah and Sayyid Qutb. Soon after leaving university, he became a religious scholar with a militant Islamist agenda. This extremist ideology prescribes identifying Muslims who violate strict Islamic principles as apostates that deserve death. And Abdel Rahman started preaching it against the secular regime of Egyptian President Gamal Nasser. In 1965, he preached at a small mosque about 60 miles south of Cairo, but his attacks against Nasser's regime led to his dismissal from his religious teaching post in 1969. This setback only intensified his hatred of Nasser and his regime. He then found work teaching at a girls' school south of Cairo in Assuit, Perturbed by his mounting attacks, Egyptian authorities arrested him in 1970, and he spent 8 months in Citadel prison. Rahman was released in 1971, but was barred from working again as a teacher until the summer of 1973, at which time he was appointed to the faculty of Aswan University, where he was awarded a post as professor of theology. In 1977, still under police surveillance, he decided to go into exile in Saudi Arabia, where he spent 3 years teaching there and became more deeply immersed in a militant, hardline form of Islam. Between 1977 and 1980, private Muslim foundations in Saudi Arabia financed a tour of teaching for Sheik Omar Abdel Rahman in the kingdom. Upon being expelled back to Egypt, he became notorious for his militant sermons and occasional fatwas, often recorded on audio tape cassettes. They were peddled openly on sidewalks in front of major mosques. During periods when the government forbade this, they were clandestinely passed from hand to hand and from one mosque congregation to another. During the 1970s, Abdel Rahman developed close ties with Egyptian Islamic Jihad and helped launch Al-Gamma Islamiyah, otherwise known as the Islamic Group, where he was eventually seen as their spiritual leader. Although still revered by followers of Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which by the 1980s was being led by Ayman al-Zawahiri, Abdel Rahman's goal with Al-Gamma Islamiyah was to overthrow the Sadat regime and establish a theocratic Islamic State. This group began carrying out terrorist attacks in Egypt before he returned from exile in Saudi Arabia in 1980. He was arrested a month before the assassination of President Anwar Sadat in October of 1981 because members of his Islamic group had participated in the assassination. Abdel Rahman was tried for conspiracy to overthrow the Egyptian government, but because the evidence was circumstantial, he was acquitted. He was released from prison in 1984, and then promptly sued the state for torturing him in prison, a suit eventually settled for $10,000. Despite his acquittal, the Egyptian government kept him under house arrest for the next 6 years, in 1985 allowing him to make a pilgrimage to Mecca. From 1985 to 1990, Abdel Rahman traveled widely throughout Europe, Africa, Asia, and the United States in 1987, speaking to Muslim audiences. But only in the late 1980s in Peshawar, Pakistan, Abdel Rahman became involved with the U.S. and Pakistani intelligence officials at the end of their orchestrated Afghan war against the Soviets. In 1989, Abdel Rahman is arrested in Egypt and held under very closely guarded house arrest, but he manages to escape to Sudan 1 year later, possibly being smuggled out of the house in a washing machine. The Blind Sheikh first enters the United States on May 10, 1990, just months before U.S. buildup against Iraq during Operation Desert Shield. He obtains his first U.S. visa via the CIA. A State Department official will later discover this was the first of 6 U.S. visas given to him between 1986 and 1990.
Despite his extreme views, the Sheikh is acquitted and released from prison. In 1990, he flees to Sudan, where the American consulate misses his name on a watch list and mistakenly issues a visa. The Blind Sheikh arrives in the United States. He settles into the Muslim community around the Al-Farouq Mosque in Brooklyn.
To try and understand why these blunders and failures occurred, we need to go to Brooklyn, only 3 miles away from the World Trade Center towers in Manhattan. This is where one finds the little Al-Farouq Mosque. At the time, it was home to the Al-Kifar Refugee Center, which is no other than the American outpost for the Afghan Services Bureau in Peshawar, led by Abdullah Azzam. Among the mosque's regulars are a number of individuals who train together, handling weapons and perfecting combat skills. Officially, they have every intention of joining the Jihad in Afghanistan. Their activities do not seem to worry local authorities, especially as their teacher is himself a junior officer in the U.S. Army.
New York, November 5th, 1990. This 34-year-old Egyptian named Sayyid Nosair dons the yarmulke of an observant Jew and pockets a .357 Magnum revolver. Nosair enters a ballroom at this Midtown Manhattan hotel. Rabbi Meir Kahane, head of the tiny but violent Jewish Defense League, is finishing a speech to his followers. As Kahane steps down from the podium, Nosair pulls out the gun, fires twice, and a fatal shot enters the rabbi's throat. Nosair flees the hotel, but an armed postal officer shoots him, and police arrest him.
On November 5th, 1990, I was having dinner with basically the response team for the Manhattan Homicide Squad in an Italian restaurant. And just as the food hit the table, the beepers went off. The people called in and they said, we have a rabbi shot in a Midtown hotel. We're hearing it's Meir Kahane.
And the guy was running down the street, and the guy shot at the post office man, and it hit him in the arm, and then the post office man shot him.
The ambulance takes Meir Kahane, who is gravely wounded, to Bellevue Hospital. Sayyid Nosair, also to Bellevue Hospital. There was a camera crew in the hospital doing some kind of documentary on life in the emergency room that just happened to be there when these two shooting victims came in. They caught it all. So in this surreal moment, they end up side by side, separated by a few feet, while doctors work feverishly. But Sayyid Nosair survives and is charged with the shooting and the murder.
For the public, and largely for law enforcement, the killing of Kahane was portrayed as one crazy Arab killing one crazy Jew.
They consider him the big Jew. He was the Jew that had the guts to stand up to the Arabs in Israel, to the neo-Nazis in America. He was the Jewish defender, if you will. And taking out Kahane meant taking out the big Jew.
Mike Gazovsky leads a group whose name means Kahane lives.
Here we see Rabbi Kahane, a Jewish leader, gunned down on the streets of New York, and the police managed to bungle up every possible aspect of the investigation. We feel that the American authorities knew about the Kahane assassination plot before it happened, that they were quite happy with it happening, and that there's a lot that the government wants to cover up here.
What was your feeling about the lone gunman theory?
I thought it was preposterous, based on what my sources in the NYPD told me, that they were ordered to treat this as a simple homicide, based on what my sources in the FBI told me, that every time that they got a little bit ambitious and started broadening their investigation to search out Sayyid Nosair's possible alleged terrorist links, they were told from atop to cool it, to stop investigating, that the NYPD would handle it as a simple homicide.
FBI and police searched Nosair's home here in Cliffside Park, New Jersey. They find more than 1,000 rounds of ammunition, bomb-making formulas, U.S. military training manuals, and a hit list of other prominent Jews. They haul 47 boxes of this material to this police precinct. But the authorities, the DA, the NYPD, the FBI, overlook most of it.
Roger Stavis. He was appointed defense lawyer for El-Nosair. Stavis's line of defense is simple. His client is part of an organization that is supported by the U.S. Secret Service. His search begins, digging up confidential documents. His investigation sheds new light on America's political agenda in Afghanistan.
As soon as I began work on the case and looked at the documents that were taken from Mr. Nosair's home, I noticed all things about Afghanistan, for Afghanistan. I noticed documents from Fort Bragg, JFK Special Warfare Center. I noted manuals about training, firing, manuals about identifying Soviet aircraft and armors and armored vehicles. All of these things. And if I could show that the people were focused on Afghanistan and aiding the Mujahedeen rebels, which was part of United States foreign policy in the 1980s, I could demonstrate that they were not waging a war of urban terrorism against the United States, but that they were, as I stated in my summation at the trial, they were on Team America. So that what I was trying to do with my defense was to make a triangle between Fort Bragg, up to New York, over to Afghanistan, and back to Fort Bragg. And the key to that was Sergeant Ali Muhammad.
At this point in time, Ali Muhammad reappears in the narrative. Stavis discovers he had been leaking documents found at Nosair's place. Ali Muhammad, at that time a sergeant in the U.S. Army, clearly made use of the documents to train Islamist groups for combat. Among the trainees was Nosair. He is the key witness Stavros needs to back up his defense. But Ali Mohammed is nowhere to be found.
What his true agenda was unknown to me. I could not find him. Who he was really working for was unknown to me. I couldn't find him despite my best efforts to do so. I wanted to have him as a witness. I sent an investigator to try to find him so I could serve him with a subpoena, which is something that would compel his testimony. And his wife in California hadn't seen him for over a year at that time.
Connections are becoming clearer while multiplying. Ali Mohammed is linked to Ayman al-Zawahiri, who gave him the responsibility of infiltrating the U.S. Army. A few years back, during the Sadat assassination trial, Zawahiri speaks to the International Press Corps. A few yards away stands another key figure of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad group, Sheik Abdel Rahman, aka the Blind Sheikh.
But as the story goes with Ali Mohammed, he left the Egyptian army in 1984 and contacted the CIA offices in Cairo, offering to be a spy, according to a U.S. official who spoke on the condition of anonymity. He then later moved and enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1986, serving in Special Forces. Not only did he train anti-Soviet Afghan Mujahedeen in the early 90s, he trained al-Qaeda volunteers and allegedly Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri. Peter Lance, who has written 3 extensive books on 9/11, one of which particularly documenting the thorough case of Ali Mohammed as a double agent for the CIA, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, who also entered the U.S. working as a translator covertly for al-Zawahiri's first U.S. tour of mosques. While in the U.S., it's said that Ali Mohammed trained Sayyid Nosair and Muhammad Abu Halima, which is why after the Meir Kahane assassination, with also all the army training manuals found in Nosair's place, Ali already became a person of interest to U.S. authorities even before 1993, as he doesn't seem to appear anywhere in the narrative of the World Trade Center bombing. But Ali does become linked to the 1998 East Africa Embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, and is charged for it. We will be further re-examining these claims and the profile of Ali Mohammed much later in the film, but for the time being, we move ahead to 1991.
Brooklyn, New York, February 1991. The Blind Sheikh gives speeches denouncing his fellow Egyptian, Mustafa Shalaby, who runs the recruitment center at the Brooklyn Mosque. Both men are allies of bin Laden, but they disagree about how to use all the money that Shalaby raised for the Afghan Jihad. Shalaby wants to use it for charity, but the Blind Sheikh wants to use the money for terrorism. His ally, bin Laden, is agitating to strike back at the U.S. in the wake of the Gulf War. Bin Laden is incensed that the U.S. has established bases in his native Saudi Arabia, the Holy Land of Mecca and Medina. The Blind Sheikh's attacks continue. Shalaby has decided that he and his wife should travel home to Egypt. On the day that Shalaby's wife is heading to the airport, Ali Mohammed happens to be in New York and gives her a ride. March 1st, 1991. A neighbor in Shalaby's Coney Island apartment building notices his door open. Inside, Shalaby lies in a pool of blood. He's been stabbed, shot, and strangled. The apartment has been ransacked. Police suspect the Blind Sheikh is behind the murder, but they find no physical evidence that connects anyone to the crime, and there are no arrests. According to terrorism expert Steve Emerson, Ali Mohammed may be the reason why. He allegedly receives an assignment from the Blind Sheikh's terror cell.
After the killing, he was brought in to clean up the apartment and to make sure that nobody who was involved in the killing could ever be found. That murder was never solved to this day.
With Shalaby out of the way, the Blind Sheikh takes over the Al-Khifa Center. He allows this al-Qaeda associate from Texas, a 30-year-old Lebanese American named Wadih El-Hage, to manage it briefly.
Wadih El-Hage is one of the important and yet underrated figures in this so-called buildup of Al-Qaeda. One of the intriguing aspects about El-Hage is that he's one of the very few figures in this whole nexus that is also Lebanese, like suspected 9/11 hijacker Ziad Jarrah. Even though the 1990s has just begun, El-Hage does not necessarily become involved in the World Trade Center bombing or even the attacks of September 11th. Right before Mustafa Shalaby's death, El-Hage was already suspected of being linked to the killing of a liberal imam in Tucson, Dr. Rashid Khalifa, who preached at the Masjid Tucson. While in Arizona, El-Hage was already functioning as bin Laden's financial secretary, having reportedly bought a T-39 aircraft like this one from a businessman in 1993, and had it retrofitted and flown to Sudan. El-Hage also ends up getting involved in the East Africa embassy bombings and is eventually captured and charged. We will continue discussing him much later in the film as well. But continuing on with 1991.
Brooklyn, New York, November 1991. Members of the Al-Farouq Mosque are raising funds for the defense of Sayyid Nosair. Nosair is about to go on trial for the murder of Rabbi Meir Kahane. Outspoken civil rights attorney William Kunstler is hired to defend Nosair. Eyewitnesses testify they saw Nosair crouched by Kahane holding a gun. But Kunstler convinces the jury that no scientific evidence links Nosair to the shooting.
Minutes after the verdict, the emotions that erupted in the courtroom spilled out of the courthouse. The supporters of Sayyid Nosair were jubilant.
And we thank God for that, because everybody in the beginning thought is Mr. Nosair, he's a murderer. But thank God for that, and he's innocent 100%.
I think it's a marvelous thing. I think the jury came to a reasoned conclusion, and I think that it's a big victory.
And followers of the murdered Rabbi Meir Kahane were livid, saying the system had not delivered justice.
There wasn't one Jew on that jury. There were black and white Christians, and you could rest assured that there was a Muslim on that jury.
This is a travesty of justice tonight here in the city of New York. This is a message to be sent out to the public that you can get away with the assassination of Jewish leaders.
It was tense in the courtroom as the verdict was read. He was found not guilty of second-degree murder, not guilty of attempted murder in the first degree for the shooting of the postal officer, and not guilty of attempted murder in the second degree for the shooting of the elderly man. Nosair was found guilty on the lesser charges, criminal possession of a weapon, 2 counts of second-degree assault, and coercion for commandeering a cab while fleeing the scene of a crime. Kahane followers shouted death to Nosair as the guards shouted, "Get out of here." So the emotions were carried outdoors, along with the defense attorney William Kunstler.
Sayyid Nosair was the young Palestinian so outraged by the poison that Kahane spread and was spreading throughout America and throughout Israel.
13 years ago, he moved to Israel, where he now crusades to throw all Arabs out of that country.
The Arab is a cancer in our midst. And you don't coexist with a cancer. A cancer you either cut out and throw out, or you die.
That he engaged in an act of political assassination, sort of Palestinian rage. I think that was the narrative that Bill had, but then Nosair insisted he didn't do it. That in fact he wasn't the gunman. He didn't pull the trigger.
Nosair's attorney argued Nosair did not kill the radical rabbi as he spoke to a group of supporters at the Marriott Hotel. Rather, he was framed. A gun dropped near him after he was shot on Lexington Avenue. William Kunstler, Nosair's attorney, suggested Kahane was in fact killed by disgruntled followers in an argument over money. Nosair was acquitted on the murder charges, despite the fact several people attending the Kahane speech said they saw him run from the room with a gun in his hand, despite the fact a cab driver outside the hotel claimed Nosair hijacked his cab and put a gun to his head. No one, however, claimed seeing Nosair pull the trigger. Nosair did not testify, but while bleeding and being treated at Bellevue Hospital that night, he claimed a man with a yarmulke did the shooting and that he ran from the hotel because he was the only Arab in the place.
They went in with that defense and it carried because nobody could say they saw him. And all the excitement, they saw as usual nothing. And they proved nothing. And that happened. It caused riots all over the world.
The trial was bitter.
There were several times during the proceedings itself where fights started right in the courtroom between these two sides.
We want justice! We want justice! 2 Arabs for every Jew.
Nosair smiled broadly tonight when the verdict came down. Pandemonium erupting in the courtroom. As Kahane followers screamed death to Nosair, Nosair followers erupted in cheers.
This story was a trick from some group of Jews tried to get rid of Kahane, which he announced before, years ago. Meir Kahane He announced years ago that if he will be killed, he will be killed by one of his own group.
People speculate that Meir Kahane could wind up dead. You know that?
I know that.
And you have suggested that it would not be at the hands of an Arab, but at the hands of a Jew.
Yes.
Why would they want to murder Meir Kahane now?
Because they are frustrated. They know of no other way to stop him.
You know, the guy had powder burned supposedly on his hand, and Bill got that guy acquitted. So he was obviously an incredible lawyer, but people were pretty mad at that, you know, very angry about what happened with Nosair.
Lining the entire courtroom, trying to prevent violence. They did prevent violence. There was no actual violence, but there was an emotional outburst when the not guilty verdicts were read. There was crying and screaming, and one Jewish supporter shouted, "A license to kill." Both outside and inside the courtroom, the reaction was emotional and explosive when the not guilty verdicts were read in the murder trial of Sayyid Nosair. Jewish supporters of the slain Rabbi Meir Kahane were outraged, and Arab supporters of Nosair were beside themselves with joy. The verdicts came after 4 full days of sometimes contentious deliberations. Defense attorneys say someone else shot Kahane, and the verdicts backed up their contention. But Jewish supporters of the slain rabbi who founded the Jewish Defense League say there was no justice in the courtroom.
The only justice for Nosair is Jewish justice, which is death. And for the rest of his life, he's going to have to look behind his back because he is going to be not amongst the living.
Amen.
And Kahane Chai, Kahane does live.
During the emotional trial, there had been almost daily demonstrations outside the courthouse, and tonight was no exception. Pandemonium broke out inside the courtroom as the verdict was announced. Dozens of Nosair supporters shouted in praise of Allah.
As Nosair's cousin Ibrahim Al-Gabroni is spotlighted amongst cheerful supporters, surrounded by him, you can see an early glimpse of future conspirators and associates. This red-haired individual is Mahmoud Abu Halina, aka the Red, who will be dubbed as the World Trade Center bombing ringleader. The person below him is another Egyptian, Ahmed Abdel Sattar, who is known as one of the Blind Sheikh's aides and interpreters. He won't be known for engaging or charged with any terrorism throughout the course of the 90s, but Sattar will become a political subject of the Blind Sheikh 10 years later after 9/11. Also visible in other angles amongst Nosair supporters is this Palestinian, Mohamed Salameh, who will become one of the main World Trade Center bombing conspirators. But before Nosair's sentencing, Kahane supporters still sought vengeance and were determined to wield their power on an international stage.
We have assembled here today to seek justice for Kahane.
He stood in the same room at the same spot where his movement's namesake was assassinated and promised more protests. It was November of last year when extremist Rabbi Meir Kahane spoke at this podium, and moments later lay mortally wounded on the carpet, a victim of an assassin's bullets. Sayyid Nosair, the Egyptian-born Muslim who was accused of his killing, was found not guilty of the murder Saturday, but was convicted of shooting a Kahane audience member and a postal officer who wounded him as he escaped.
I was in shock, but not amazement. We predicted Jews in this nation do not often get justice in criminal courts.
It was a verdict that deeply angered Kahane supporters, and they are now demanding Nosair's extradition to Israel.
A special team of attorneys are on their way here from Israel to investigate the options for an extradition of Nosair to Israel to face charges for crimes against Rabbi Meir Kahane and crimes against the Jewish people.
That is just abject, emotional buffoonery. I don't think there is a legal basis whatsoever that would support Mr. Nosair being extradited to Israel. First of all,
Nosair's attorney, Michael Warren, is not worried about his client being sent to Israel, but about the possibility the judge may hit Nosair with a maximum sentence of 24 years.
I hope he does not allow this group of people to intimidate and coerce him into sentencing this man to the maximum sentence, because he has had no prior contact with this system, criminal justice system. He has a family, he's an American citizen. He should be entitled to the same benefit as any other person who goes through this system.
Nosair's attorney, Michael Warren, today said there is no legal basis for the extradition to Israel, but he takes seriously the continuing death threats.
These people have had a history of making these types of threats,
And what's even more significant is they make them with impunity. You haven't heard Mayor Dinkins, you haven't heard Commissioner Brown, you haven't heard the FBI say anything about the threats that have been made, not only against the family, but against the jurors, against myself, against my co-counsels over the past several days.
And Kahane supporters still held protests and demonstrations on the Brooklyn Bridge.
And there are threats of handling the matter outside the law.
I believe and I hope that in the near future, Nosair will no longer be among the living.
Call in the FBI and investigate the possibility of bringing federal charges against Nosair for the violation of the civil rights of Rabbi Kahane.
The Egyptian is found guilty only of a minor weapons charge.
The FBI starts to get closely interested in the Blind Sheikh, as a number of tapes containing his sermons are discovered in the home of Sayyid Nosair, Rabbi Kahane's killer.
It was extremely difficult to get very close information. We developed a lot of information from the people on the outside looking in, but we were having a lot of trouble developing first-hand information from his inner circle.
The FBI decides to increase its surveillance of the Sheikh, even managing to infiltrate his immediate circle, thanks to Emad Salem, the terrorist bomb maker who in reality is an undercover FBI agent, who manages to infiltrate the group and blend with the Sheikh's faithful. Fearing retaliation, the man, whose name at the time was Emad Salem, has since changed identities and now lives in hiding.
John Antisev, Agent John, one day came to me with Agent Nancy Floyd and they said, "We have a picture, we want to show it to you. Do you know this man?" I said, "Of course, this is Sheik Omar Abdel Rahman." "Who is Sheik Omar?" I said, "He is the one who ordered the assassination of my president." "Oh, well, guess what? He is in America." I said, "It's a surprise for me because I know that since he escaped from Egypt, he is being listed on the terrorist lists and he should not be in any country." They said, "Well, somehow he managed to come to America and he lives in New Jersey."
To this day, I don't know why the Blind Sheikh was issued a U.S. visa to come to the United States. It's never been adequately explained. I don't think even the 9/11 Commission was able to get to the bottom of it.
Acquitted for the murder, Nosair is still convicted for charges of gun possession and assault.
I went to visit Sayyid Nosair in prison, and his cousins introduced me as a brother Emad, and Sayyid Nosair accepted me as a friend.
They're saying, "Well, so, what next?" And he said, "What next? What next is up to you."
Verbatim words on Sayyid Nosair, "I had done my part. Now it is your duty to do that jihad."
Emad Salem gradually becomes part of the Blind Sheikh's inner circle. Emad continues to spend time with Islamist groups tied to the Al-Farouq Mosque in Brooklyn and to El-Nosair. Now totally infiltrated into the group, he cannot turn back.
I was in Brooklyn with Ibrahim el-Gabroni. Ibrahim el-Gabroni is Sayyid Nosair's cousin. He said that we should start to do something, brother, so the government have some pressure and they don't put brother Sayyid in more troubles. So I said, "Sure, of course we should do something." He said, "Okay, do you know how to build a bomb?" I said, "Of course, that's what we do." He said, "Okay, I want you to build some bombs and I'll tell you later, what do you need?" So I said to Ibrahim el-Gabroni, "I need explosives, I need detonators, I need people to help me build the bombs, I need a safe place to build the bomb in." He said, "Okay, let me make some phone calls to Afghanistan." Sayyid Nosair described to me how to buy the ingredients in Chinatown. So I bought fuse, I bought some ingredients, and I went back to John Antisev.
What Emad reveals to the agent is a death list, including the names of a United States Senator from New York, Alphonse D'Amato, and the judge in El-Sayed Nosair's trial, plus a handful of local justices and politicians.
They wanted to kill 12 people. It was starting to really get intense. It eventually morphed into them asking Emad to make 12 pipe bombs. And then it became a serious issue. As an intelligence asset, what we say in our business, he was made promises that he did not have to testify in any type of criminal proceedings. And that's the way when we took him, we did not dispute that, knowing that at the time this would never go, there wouldn't be an issue anytime soon. So when he started getting involved with talks of assassinations and pipe bombs, of course we had to change gears, and we had to go from an intelligence gathering operation to a criminal investigation and gathering evidence, trying to arrest these people. At this moment in time, the number one witness against everybody is Emad Salem himself, and he did not want to testify. And we were trying to convince Emad to wear a wire. So when he met with these people and talked about assassinations and killings and pipe bombs, that he would record the conversations of the people. And he refused. Like I said, very stubborn, proud man. He wasn't going to be forced to do anything. And our superiors wanted him to wear a wire. And unfortunately, they got into an issue of who was going to be the stronger will. So they put it to him, if you don't wear a wire, if you don't, testify in court, we're not going to continue to pay you.
They start to ask me to wear a wire. And I understood that once I wear a wire, I have to testify in court. If I testify in court and my identity became public, then Sheikh Omar's followers in Cairo, they will kidnap my sister and behead her. It was a silly personal confrontation, and actually he said, and I quote him, "You son of a bitch, coming from the Middle East, dragging sand in your shoes all the way up to here to tell me how to run my FBI and how to do my job?" I told him, "Sir, I am doing your job. None of your agents could have went undercover that deep. I'm doing it. You're not." And that even provoked him more, and he said, "Get out of here." I walked out of his office. I looked at Nancy and John. I said, "Guys, when this bomb been built by somebody and goes off by somebody else, don't come knock on my door." And that was it, and I walked away.
When I heard Emad was gone, I said, I can't believe it. I was so, disheartened and nervous and mad.
I mean, I let them know exactly what I thought. I said, "This is insane." I said, you have a guy that's worked his butt off getting us this information, and God only knows what else is out there, and we're stopping this? The suits up there have no idea about surveillance, no idea about intelligence gathering.
Back in New York, Emad Salem is finding that quitting a terror cell can be complicated.
They continued for a month after I walked out, calling me every day, "Hey, brother, you gotta come to finish what you started." Sayyid Nosair called me from Attica prison. "Brother, don't be afraid. I have a lot of money to hire attorneys for you if something goes wrong. Brother, you gotta come finish cooking." And of course, I'm not a cook. What I was cooking is about to build a bomb. And every time I get these calls, I call John Antisiv, and I immediately reported that to John.
What Emad and the FBI would learn too late is that the cell had found itself a new cook.
When Emad left the group in July of '92, another individual came in September, and that person was Ramzi Yousef.
The Blind Sheikh and his contacts in Afghanistan are quick to find a replacement for Emad Salem. He arrives a few days later at JFK Airport in New York on a flight coming from Pakistan.
A Pakistani Airlines flight from Karachi lands here at Kennedy Airport. Seated in the first-class cabin, Ramzi Yousef. He's traveling with a Palestinian terrorist named Ahmad Al-Hage. The two men exit the plane and approach parallel stalls at an immigration post. The 6-foot-tall Yousef, dressed in a 3-piece silk Afghan suit, presents a perfectly forged Iraqi passport. He demands political asylum. When immigration officials question Al-Hage, they discover that he's carrying several crudely fake passports and a suitcase stuffed with bomb-making manuals. Immigration agents take Al-Hage into custody. They assign him a bed at this INS detention facility, but Yousef is allowed into the U.S. and told to appear at an immigration hearing.
Though the narrative of most mainstream documentaries asserts that Sheik Omar Abdel Rahman was in need of more conspirators with expertise, exclusive from the Afghan region, and that essentially this time in early September of 1992 is when Ramzi Yousef first arrives in the United States, the circumstances with his traveling companion, the Palestinian Ahmed Al-Hage, is overlooked and does not necessarily fit the establishment narrative based around Salem's absence, as Ahmed Al-Hage had already been residing in Houston, Texas since late 1991, having been granted political asylum, living with some of his relatives there, working as a Domino's pizza delivery driver. On April 24, 1992, months already before Salem left El Gabroni and Nosair's circles, Al-Hage left to Peshawar, Pakistan, abandoning his first asylum claim while using a different alias, and from there to Camp Calden on the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. Lacking the necessary credentials, Al-Hage was sent to Saudi Arabia to obtain a letter of recommendation. A month later, Al-Hage then flew to Saudi Arabia via the United Arab Emirates, where he procured a letter of introduction requesting the leader of Camp Calden to train Al-Hage in the use of weapons and explosives, to where Al-Hage then returned to Pakistan and Afghanistan via United Arab Emirates, arriving June 1992, and began a bomb-building course at Camp Calden. Only then, by August 31, 1992, using services of a Pakistani travel agent, Al-Hage and Ramzi Yousef boarded a flight in Peshawar and flew to Karachi and then on to JFK in New York. The INS handed Al-Hage to Wackenhut Correctional Corporation for incarceration in a converted warehouse in Queens. Later he pleaded guilty to the use of an altered passport and was sentenced to 6 months. But as previously mentioned, Ramzi Yousef does get into the country and eventually connects with Mohamed Salameh, for where they'll become roommates throughout New Jersey, essentially networking with Mahmoud Abu Halima, Nadel Ayad, and others throughout the coming months. Yousef's real name is Abdul Basit Mahmoud Abdul Karim. Ramzi Yousef is the main alias he uses, but it's known that he's used well over a dozen. Various sources state that he was either born in Iraq, Kuwait, or the United Arab Emirates, even though it's more widely believed that he was born in Kuwait. He comes from Pakistani and Palestinian parents. When his family moved to Pakistan in the mid-1980s, Yousef was sent to the UK for education in 1986, where he enrolled in Swansea Institute in Wales and studied electrical engineering, graduating 4 years later. He also studied at Oxford College of Further Education to improve his English. But separate from the backgrounds of these two proposed bomb makers, it's also important to look back in retrospect as to what was happening in this time frame in 1992, such as what happens on November 3rd, as Democratic Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton defeats Republican President George H.W. Bush and Independent Ross Perot in the 1992 presidential election. But globally speaking, as the Western world is still adapting to the fall of the Wall and Soviet Union, on December 3rd, the UN Security Council Resolution 794 is unanimously passed, approving a coalition of the United States peacekeepers led by the U.S. to form UNITAF, tasked with ensuring humanitarian aid gets distributed and establishing peace in Somalia. The following day, December 4th, U.S. military forces land in Somalia. December 21st, President of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, defeats Milan Panic in the Serbian presidential election. And on December 24th, soon-to-be exiting President George H.W. Bush pardoned 6 national security officials implicated in the Iran-Contra affair, including Caspar Weinberger. On New Year's Day, January 1st, 1993, Czechoslovakia ceases to exist as the Czech Republic and Slovakia separate into the so-called Velvet Divorce. 2 days later, on January 3rd, 1993, Presidents George H.W. Bush and Boris Yeltsin signed the Second Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty in Moscow. And on the day before inauguration, January 19, 1993, Iraq refuses to allow UNSCOM inspectors to use its own aircraft to fly into Iraq, becoming the early stages of the Iraq disarmament crisis. Essentially, Bush Sr. handing Clinton over residual escalations of Desert Storm. The U.S. military began operations in the demilitarized zone between Iraq and Kuwait, and the northern Iraqi no-fly zones. The U.S. fired 40 Tomahawk cruise missiles at Baghdad factories linked to Iraq's alleged illegal nuclear weapons program, with Iraq then subsequently informing UNSCOM that it will be able to resume its flights. Then the following day, January 20th, 1993, Bill Clinton is sworn in as the 42nd President of the United States.
Throughout the fall and winter, Yousef and 3 other members of the Al-Farouq Mosque are hard at work inside this storage facility in Jersey City, New Jersey, just across the Hudson River from Manhattan. Under Yousef's direction, they assemble the device they hope will topple the Twin Towers and kill thousands of people.
One mischaracterization from mainstream documentaries about the upcoming Trade Center plot is that it was central to the Al-Farouq Mosque in Brooklyn, New York, tied in with the recruitment for the Mujahedeen in Afghanistan, when in actuality, it was the Masjid al-Salam in New Jersey where the Blind Sheikh frequently held sermons at and bombing conspirators attended. But continuing with the story leading up to constructing the bomb, on January 24th, Ramzi Yousef and Mohamed Salameh, while driving a car, get into a wreck. The reason for the incident is alleged to have been due to Salameh's clumsy driving, which resulted in Ramzi Yousef being severely injured, requiring hospitalization. But throughout the course of Ramzi Yousef's endeavors during this time period, it has never been stated that he had met with Sayyid Nosair while in prison, who seemed to be at the center of it all as far as organizing actions, although it is probable that they had at least met once by this point. But similarly, Yousef was still able to construct the Trade Center bomb with assistance yet still from El-Hage, while also incarcerated. El-Hage remained in contact with Yousef and other co-conspirators and continued to be involved with the World Trade Center bombing plot. El-Hage never contacted Yousef directly. Calls were patched through an associate in Dallas, rendering law enforcement detection more difficult. In a connected conversation, El-Hage brought up the bomb-making manuals that were confiscated after his arrest at JFK Airport, informing Yousef that the court had ordered the government to return El-Hage's belongings while incarcerated, therefore enabling El-Hage to give Yousef bomb-making directives and tips.
February 26, 1993.
11:15 a.m. Emad Ismail and Ramzi Yousef are driving a 10-foot yellow Ryder van. Following them is a car driven by Mohamed Salameh. Salameh had leased the van from a Ryder rental agency in Jersey City 3 days earlier. It now carries a 1,500-pound bomb made of urea nitrate and hydrogen. 11:55 a.m. The yellow Ryder van pulls into level B2 of the World Trade Center garage. Emad Ismail steers it to an illegal parking space. Ramzi Yousef lights a fuse on the bomb. The fuse is encased in rubber, which suppresses smoke and allows for a 10 to 20 minute burn time. Yousef and Ismail jump into Salameh's car and speed out of the garage. 12:10 p.m. The fuse on the bomb has been burning for 6 minutes. It's 12:17 p.m.
I'd gotten into the elevator and pressed 65.
I'm approached by an individual who asks for directions to the Newark train.
We're waiting now for the elevator to come for us.
I was standing within the door frame and had just opened the door to my office.
We entered an elevator on the 72nd floor.
I was cutting insulation, putting it on the cart.
I was in my office and my friend was coming up and we were gonna have pizza.
I got out of the car, opened the backseat door, reached for my things, had my car keys in my hand.
The rental van detonates with a force equivalent to 800 pounds of TNT, tearing through 11-inch concrete floors in the bowels of America's famous landmark.
I was physically lifted up into the air and thrown back with terrific force.
All of a sudden, just boom, something hit me, and it's like, it took my breath away. It blew me across the room.
The exterior walls of the garage came caving into the path concourse level.
There was mass confusion. People were running out of the building, ambulances were pulling up, fire trucks were pulling up.
Police set up a command center on the street outside Tower 1.
Smoke was emitting from every single floor.
A possible bomb explodes under the towering World Trade Center in New York. 5 people are killed, 500 injured.
Thousands poured out of the building, gasping for air. Eyes glazed with shock, they spoke of the devastation within.
There was no help whatsoever. Trapped on 94 floors all the way up. Nobody came.
There was smoke, and then the lights went out, and I'd say about 70 floors we had no lights.
Stairwells became smokestacks. Clouds of soot billowed up the stairs to the very top of the 110-story office towers. Some evacuees say they couldn't see their hands outstretched in front of them as they groped their way down to the ground, choking on the smoke.
The walls just blew in, and everything went blank after that. Walls collapsed, furniture's down. It's a mess downstairs.
The explosion blasted a gaping hole through the ceiling of the second sub-basement in Tower Number 1. This is where firefighters say the injuries were most severe. A crowded stop for commuter trains that shuttle workers across the Hudson to New Jersey. The offices just above the area lie in ruin.
Although 9/11 seems to overshadow the 1993 World Trade Center bombing in spectacular levels, still, as with most standard 9/11 truth films, the February 26, 1993 bombing and the evacuation of the Twin Towers does have premonition value, dramatic stories, and reporting.
That place is a death trap. Let me tell you something. There was smoke where there shouldn't be smoke. I was on the 107th floor, and we heard the bang, and that place filled up in 5 minutes.
The building rattled. The whole thing shook. We thought it was a massive bomb. There was confusion, chaos. The smoke was everywhere. You couldn't see, and when I was in the bank, everyone hit the deck.
But there are also stories of heroism and survival. In fact, one forgotten case is with a school field trip tour of the Twin Towers, where a group of grade school kids and their teachers were in the elevators when the bombing occurred and were trapped for over 6 hours.
We didn't have much air, because the smoke was coming in. We had to take off our shirts because it was pretty hot in there and sweaty. Everybody was scared. I want my dad. I want my mom. Yeah, I was crying most of the time.
You were?
Yeah.
Why?
Because I thought we were going to spend the night there for the rest of our lives.
Ultimately, as what most experts have said, that if the 1993 bombing would have succeeded, it would have been worse in loss of life compared to 9/11. Even though we have demonstrated mainstream sources that claim the bomb was ignited by a flame and fuse, authorities were never actually able to prove that it was that method in which the bomb was ignited. Even after sweeping through the entire crime scene in an attempt to try to find any mechanical components which could have been used instead, they were unsuccessful in finding anything, as some experts thought it was possible that the device was activated electronically. But in an effort to minimize time and focus on criminal investigations rather than any forensic investigation analyzing the crime scene solely, this late evening witness account is of worthy importance, not just being a precursor to 9/11, but because it's an inside reaction demonstrating how confirmed explosives from the first attack instinctively made some survivors feel that it was a plane that struck the building.
We have with us here Warren Hernania, and Warren, you work in the building.
Yes, I do.
What was it like? Where were you?
On the 80th floor.
What happened?
I was on the phone with a friend of mine, and all of a sudden I heard this tremendous explosion. For a brief moment, the building rocked. I thought that an aircraft hit the building or a bomb went off. After that, the power was gone, and a few minutes later, the lights went off. Then about 5 minutes later, we smelled some smoke.
And how long did it take you to get out of the building? How did you get out?
We took the stairway down. It took us roughly about 2.5 hours to exit the building.
2.5 hours.
Right.
And could you see during most of that time? Were there lights or not?
No, most of the time there was lights. Then we hit some darkness, but more or less everything was in a calm manner.
I understand you have a car in this building.
Yes, I do.
Was it in the area where the explosion occurred?
I think so, yes.
Is that why you're back here?
Yes.
The bomb was a urea nitrate device enhanced with hydrogen gas, and it ripped through a 30-meter wide hole through 4 sublevels of concrete. It destroyed many vehicles and infrastructure under the building, creating a massive inferno that took firemen battling it until the next day to finally put it out, which had prevented investigators until then to reach the blast crater in order to perform their tasks. The damage and fire was so bad, it was reported that an entire car had melted. And we shouldn't have to remind anyone of this scene from the 2003 documentary Collateral Damages that's constantly referenced by many 9/11 truth experts and films about the reaction of firefighter Captain Philip Rovallo at Ground Zero.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like it was lava
from a volcano.
And without any possible confusion or excuse with the airline crashes, Molten metal was also witnessed within the rubble of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Some of the firemen stated that the blast crater looked like a barbecue pit, and as another precursor,
now walk to the lip of the crater, the epicenter of the earthquake that rocked people 110 stories above. One rescue worker said it was like looking into the mouth of a volcano on Friday.
But I can guarantee you one thing about the World Trade Center bombing, is that regardless if the ignition for the explosive was undetermined, Ramzi Yousef and conspirators certainly weren't using nanothermite in 1993.
Saturday, February 27th, the morning after. One of the FBI's top explosives experts, Dave Williams, arrives from Washington.
Very hectic initially getting here, and with a 2-hour walkthrough, I was able to immediately conclude that it was an explosive device. At this time, it was decided that it was involved in a terrorist incident, and the FBI would be the lead agency. I recognize this as being the largest improvised explosive device or bomb that had detonated in the United States.
If you look at various clues in this tangled mess here, we can determine exactly where the blast occurred. And we do that by looking at the vehicles. We do that by looking at the extent of the damage, and very shortly you're brought to a particular area where the damage is most severe and where the detonation occurred.
The investigators were quickly able to determine that the source of the blast was along this exit ramp in the parking garage under the Vista Hotel. The explosion tore through this wall of the basement of Tower 1 of the World Trade Center. It ripped through several rooms in which employees of the Port Authority were working and having lunch. Think of the bomb as a massive energy source, blasting out in all directions within a confined space. Most of that energy ripped across this parking lot underneath the Vista Hotel, right up there. Several of these floors were parking areas. The steel beams that workers are installing are intended to support what is left. A huge hole was blown into the floor of B2, the parking level where the bomb was placed. It sent debris falling all the way down to level B5, where the refrigeration machinery that cools the massive towers is kept. But the explosion also generated a huge blast straight up through the lobby floor of the Vista Hotel.
It did go up through into a ballroom of the Vista, where there was to be a gathering of kids just 45 minutes later to get sports awards. The bomb went off at 12:18. They were supposed to be there at 1 o'clock.
Before the smoke clears, an investigative team descends into the carnage beneath the Trade Center.
We were able to see the shells of the cars in the parking garages that had been completely blown out. There were over 300 cars that had been destroyed.
Though initial reports indicate a transformer explosion, the scale of the damage rules out any accident.
There was such a massive amount of debris. It took on a different dimension, a different scale that we really hadn't seen before.
The bombers did $550 million worth of destruction to the World Trade Center. The financial damage caused by the disruption of national and international business was also deeply felt. America had been jolted from its belief that international terrorist attacks don't happen on American soil.
So now, amidst the rubble, law enforcement agencies are in a new race against time to find the people who did this. As the day wears on, no confirmation is given to reporters about the cause of the blast, but officials do not hide their strong suspicions.
We'll give you a certain conclusion when we can prove it. Looks like a bomb, it smells like a bomb, it's probably a bomb.
A group of investigators is assigned to work inside the crater created by the bomb. NYPD Detective Donald Sadawi and ATF Agent Joe Hanlon are assigned to the same team.
It was a survey mission. We also had the mission to attempt to take swabbings that could be taken back to the laboratory later that day and examined to possibly get a lead on the type of explosive that was used.
We didn't know who had perpetrated the bombing. People were scared. The city was scared. It was the start of a new phenomenon.
It wasn't something that just happened in London or Beirut or the Philippines. It could happen any place.
finding clues amid the rubble would be next to impossible.
The first major breakthrough in the investigation came when FBI agents at the scene of Ground Zero discovered part of the vehicle chassis of the van that had been used to transport the bomb into the building.
Miraculously, the VIN, or Vehicle Identification Number, is still legible on the manifold.
The FBI then traces the van's registration to a Ryder rental agency in New Jersey. The van was the same vehicle rented and reported stolen by Mohamed Salameh.
My beeper went off, and it was Detective Napoli calling me, and he said, I called the number, and he said, "You're not going to believe it, but they found the remnants of the van that was used to carry the explosives, and it was rented in Jersey City, and it was a Ryder company, and the person who rented it was Mohamed Salameh." And I tell you, I was like, oh my God, Mohamed Salameh. We had photographs of Mohamed. We have photographs of Mohamed training at the range. He's a friend of Nosair. He's a friend of all the guys that we've been looking at for the last few years. And I said, these are the guys we were looking at.
Salameh arrives at the rental office in New Jersey to pick up his $400 deposit on the van. When he arrives, an agent greets Salameh from behind the desk. But he is not a Ryder agent. He's an undercover agent with the FBI.
After some discussion, Salameh walked out. As he stepped out of the office, dozens of FBI agents who had been monitoring their discussion descended upon Salameh. Less than 1 week after the bombing, the FBI had a suspect in custody. Salameh said little to the agents who questioned him about the bombing. They knew it was probable that he had not acted alone.
The FBI was staking out the lot when Salameh showed up with his stolen vehicle report this morning, this time getting his $200, then walking outside.
And they must have signaled other guys up the street, and there were FBI guys on both sides of Kennedy Boulevard, and they pulled up in a car, FBI guys with their jackets, and put them in a car.
Put them in a car.
And that was the end of it. There was
no
not
resistance, nothing like that.
Not that I could see. I didn't hear any. I was right outside. I didn't hear any fighting or anything. I think they surprised him.
He came back a number of times. He came back Friday afternoon and told me that the truck was stolen from his possession.
And he wanted his $400 deposit?
He wanted his deposit back.
Sources tell Fox News the FBI has been conducting searches all over Jersey City, one of them at this apartment building. Gladys Moore, who lives here with her Egyptian boyfriend, says FBI agents broke down her door and ransacked her apartment.
Oh, they took a piece of my hair, and they put some things in my hands, and they took a test, they sent it out, they came back and they said I could go.
When Salameh was arrested, agents recovered various personal items, including his wallet, which contained several business cards and telephone numbers. They began by searching the address listed on his driver's license. A former roommate told agents that Salameh no longer lived at that address. However, they were able to find some belongings of Salameh's that he had left behind. There were news clippings and photos relating to Nosair, and a photo of him and Nosair together. There were numerous bank records. There were also more names and numbers for investigators to pursue. Analysis of all the confiscated phone records led investigators to an apartment in Jersey City. The landlord who owned the apartment at 40 Pamrapo Avenue confirmed that Salameh and another individual rented the apartment from early January of 1993 until the end of February. The landlord could not confirm the identity of Salameh's roommate. After executing the warrant, agents discovered that 40 Pamrapo Avenue was the bomb factory, the place where the conspirators mixed an explosive powerful enough to rock the World Trade Center. Inside the apartment and an adjacent garage, FBI forensic examiners recovered traces of a diverse range of chemicals. While agents searched the apartment, the identity of Salameh's mysterious roommate emerged. They found papers requesting political asylum in the name of Ramzi Yousef, who, according to the documents, had been detained in September of 1992 at Kennedy Airport for entering the country without a visa. The Pamrapo Avenue apartment was a goldmine for the FBI. At every step of the investigation, Ramzi Yousef's name appeared. He was a known international terrorist and an expert with explosives. They soon learned that he fled the country the night of the Trade Center bombing.
The international manhunt for Ramzi Yousef will take place in the coming days as the authorities further puzzle who was all involved in the bombing. But for Iyad Ismail, rather than return to Houston, Texas, where he resided and had been living in the United States for several years. Ismail took Yousef's lead and fled the country soon after to his homeland in Jordan. But Mahmoud Abu Halima, aka the Red, would briefly meet up with another associate, the Sudanese Siddiq or Siddiq Ibrahim Siddiq Ali, also tied in with the mosque and the Blind Sheikh's inner circle, and about to become an active participant in further terrorist plots in the months to come. But Abu Halima reportedly fled back to Egypt as soon as news surfaced of Mohamed Salameh's arrest.
His name is now synonymous with terrorism. Mohamed Salameh, a 25-year-old father of 4 from Jersey City, who came to the U.S. 5 years ago, and who now stands accused of being involved in the bombing of the World Trade Center. At a press conference today in Jersey City, authorities said they believe Salameh is a Palestinian who belongs to a radical Muslim group in Jersey City.
But on March 7th, a local New York news channel went to interview Salameh's family back in Jordan.
Salameh's mother, Aisha Abu Bakr, still cannot believe what is happening. That her eldest son was arrested after he allegedly tried to reclaim a deposit on a van used to carry explosives in the World Trade Center bombing. As she held pictures of her son, Abu Bakr denied that he was a terrorist. The family's small apartment in Jordan is decorated with a picture of the Dome of the Rock, a holy shrine of Islam. But Salameh's brothers deny that their sibling is a Muslim fundamentalist. They do say that he is religious, and that right before he left for the United States in 1987, Salameh underwent a noticeable change. One brother said that he started to pray and read the Quran with his friends. He even grew a beard. But both the family and a Jordanian government official say that the suspect had no extremist beliefs.
He was not politically motivated. He was a young man, you know, and he just didn't have any political inclinations or any political activism.
Meanwhile, Salameh's mother told about a shy and peaceful boy who loved to play soccer and watch westerns. She recalled the dreams that he would go to business school in America. And now she says that she just prays that justice will allow her son to come home.
Protests were erupting outside the Mujahid al-Salam mosque.
Tonight, many Muslims around the U.S. are complaining that the arrest of Salameh has turned them into innocent victims of a backlash. Arab American groups say they are receiving threatening and obscene phone calls. And police in Jersey City say the mosque where Salameh worshipped was the target of vandals this weekend. The spokesman for the Al-Salam Mosque on Kennedy Boulevard says a statement has been sent to several politicians, including the president, that condemns the bombing.
Totally against our religion. We're not responsible for anybody who commit any kind of violence.
The Al-Salam Mosque was also the scene of a peaceful protest today by the Coalition for Jewish Concerns.
Even as the FBI was searching the apartment, Rabbi Avi Weiss and a group of Jewish protesters were demonstrating in front of Jersey City's Masjid al-Salam Mosque. Now, this is the mosque led by the so-called revolutionary fundamentalist Sheik Omar Abdel Rahman, who was acquitted in Egypt in 1981 of involvement in the assassination of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. Sayyid Nosair, tried and acquitted of the 1990 murder of Jewish right-wing leader Rabbi Meir Kahane, gunned down in Manhattan, is said to be a follower of the Sheikh, as is bomb suspect Mohamed Salameh. Members of the mosque are concerned and upset that they may be being judged unfairly by the actions of a few.
I hope the media listen to us and hear our side and give us a fair hearing and a fair judgment. We are not a terrorist. By all means, we are not terrorists.
2 days later, the chemical engineer Nadel Ayad is arrested.
The FBI has made a number of massive breaks in the case. Number one, they now have reason to believe they know the quantity of explosive materials used in the bomb. They believe that they know where the bomb may have been assembled. And now, with the arrest of this man, they think they have arrested a person who may very well have assisted in assembling that bomb. His name is Nadel Ayad, and he apparently was one of the men allowed to go into and out of that 10-foot by 10-foot rented locker in the commercial space station rental lockers on Mallory Avenue in Jersey City. The FBI now believe the bomb was assembled in that locker, which was allegedly leased by Mohamed Salameh. On Friday, investigators searching the locker found some 300 pounds of explosive materials, including nitric and sulfuric acid and a quantity of nitroglycerin. Documents found in the locker established that the materials, over 1,600 pounds of it, had been purchased and paid for, not stolen. By subtracting the 300 pounds remaining in the locker from the original 1,600 pounds on the sales slips and invoices, investigators now believe the bomb placed in the trade center was a massive 1,300 pounds of explosives.
Witnesses have reported seeing Salameh and at least 3 other men, one now believed to have been Ayad, repeatedly going into and out of that rented locker over a period of time, possibly, investigators say, to mix the materials and to assemble the explosive device. A portion of that device may have been taken to this house on Pamrapo Street, where Salameh lived for a short period of time. He moved out of the house just 2 days after the Trade Center bombing. A police search of the apartment uncovered a pattern of nitric acid stains on the walls, indicating that some of the explosive materials may have been destabilized and exploded. The FBI has now issued subpoenas to the Jersey City Medical Center asking for records of anyone asking for or receiving treatment for nitric acid burns.
And New York's Fox 5 later went on to do their own interview and background cover of Ayad's family.
For the first time, some of those rounded up in the investigation of the World Trade Center bombing are talking. They say the man believed by some to be the bomb builder is an innocent victim. Christopher Jones has this exclusive report.
All of us were sleeping at the time, and all I heard is the door broke, and they came in, they arrested everybody in the house.
Razik Ayad is the younger brother of Nidal Ayad, who was charged in connection with the infamous World Trade Center bombing. Razik was arrested but later released.
I'm 100% sure that he's innocent, and he has nothing to do with that.
Razik spoke exclusively with Fox interviewer Daphne Barak. He described the suspect as a good husband to a new bride and a dutiful son.
He's a very caring person. He always takes care of us and asks if we need any kind of help. He helped me do my schoolwork, and that's it. He's a very intelligent guy. I think it's a mistake that just because he's a friend of the suspect that they arrested.
But authorities charged Nidal Ayad, a chemical engineer, with aiding and abetting Mohamed Salameh, the first man arrested for the bombing. They claim the 2 men even shared a New Jersey bank account.
Do you know Mohamed Salameh?
No, I just saw him a couple of times. He came over to congratulate my brother on his marriage. And that's it, that's the time I saw him.
Authorities claim another link between the 2 men is a Jersey City mosque where a radical Muslim cleric, Sheik Omar Abdel Rahman, preaches.
That sheikh, I never heard about him until they show him on TV. And I don't think my brother knew him either. We're just normal Muslim people, we're not fanatics.
Just a few months ago, Nidal celebrated his wedding to a young Jordanian woman. Fox News has obtained exclusively these pictures of Ayad with his 18-year-old bride, Reem. She is now pregnant with their first child. Their marriage was arranged by his mother, who went to Jordan to make sure Reem was suitable for the family. They are now trying to free him on bail, and they visit him as often as possible.
I'm 100% sure that my brother is innocent, and I'm sure that he wouldn't do such a thing because he's the one that takes care of us in the house. And plus he has a pregnant wife, and I don't think he'll do that.
Authorities were able to trace Ayad through phone calls he had made to Yousef while he was in a hospital briefly recovering from the car accident he was in with Mohamed Salameh. But on the same day that Salameh was arrested, after going through several apartments he had lived at, authorities discovered that he also had an address which belongs to Sayyid Nosair's cousin, Ibrahim al-Ghabrani, who then also gets arrested.
A third man, Ibrahim al-Ghabrani, believed to have shared his apartment with Salameh, was also indicted on lesser charges of possessing false passports and fighting FBI agents searching his home.
When the FBI came to search Ibrahim al-Ghabrani's apartment, which was connected to Salameh through his driver's license, they also found multiple Nicaraguan passports, with some of them already made out to his cousin Nosair and his family members. El-Ghabrani punched an FBI agent and was charged with hindering the search. It was said that right before this, either El-Ghabrani urinated in his hands or had quickly washed his hands in a toilet full of urine, which was suspected that he was attempting to wash off any possible explosive residue detection. Incidentally, around this time, New York authorities will announce they are reopening the murder case of Rabbi Meir Kahane. But as the authorities had 3 suspects already in custody, with 2 of them directly charged for the bombing and continually looking for others, things were still heating up around the mosque and the legal residency to one of its controversial clerics.
A militant Muslim sheikh is now fighting to stay in Jersey City or anywhere in the United States. An immigration judge has ordered him deported. Meanwhile, 2 of the sheikh's followers are among those indicted today for the World Trade Center bombing.
The indictment charged the 25-year-old Mohamed Salameh and 25-year-old Nidal Ayad willfully damaged the World Trade Center with an explosive device, causing the death of 6 persons. A third man, Ibrahim al-Ghabrani, was indicted on obstruction of justice and fraud. The mayor said these are charges against people, not a people. Two of those indicted were followers of Sheik Omar Abdel Rahman, who was ordered deported by a U.S. immigration judge. The Immigration Service said that Abdel Rahman, who lives in Jersey City, did not disclose that he is a polygamist and was convicted in Egypt of falsifying a check. Both are grounds for exclusion from the U.S. A lawyer for the sheikh says he will fight the order. He has 10 days to appeal. Abdul Rahman was once charged in Egypt in the death of President Anwar Sadat, but he has denounced the World Trade Center bombing. Here at the mosque in Jersey City, where the sheikh has preached in the past, worshippers wouldn't talk on camera. They said if the interviews were seen in Egypt, their families might be persecuted. But they said the sheikh is a good man who is innocent of any charges and does not preach violence.
And word tonight that a suspect in the World Trade Center bombing fled the country and may be in Pakistan. Several New Jersey papers reported today that 33-year-old Mahmoud Abu Halima, an Egyptian national with a German passport, left from Kennedy Airport 2 days after Salameh's arrest.
And on the following day, it would seem that the Blind Sheikh was laying low by visiting Los Angeles and taking the opportunity to do interviews addressing accusations that he had something to do with the World Trade Center bombing.
The blind cleric, Sheik Omar Abdel Rahman, says neither he, nor his mosque, nor his religion would tolerate terrorism.
This is a false accusation that these people who bombed the World Trade Center, they are my followers. These are false accusations.
The sheikh said he does not know either Nidal Ayad or Mohamed Salameh, the two men charged in the bombing, although anyone is welcome to worship with him.
They can pray in any mosque, but there is no any connection between me and them. And don't show me to all the world that I've been accused.
But this man, Mahmoud Abu Halima, now considered a suspect, is said to be close to the sheikh.
I don't know him and I don't know where he is.
Abu Halima is a cab driver who may have fled to Pakistan after the bombing. Reportedly, he was once the sheikh's personal driver.
I don't have a car, so that how come he drive a car that I don't have?
Sheikh Rahman said his religion, Islam, does not condone attacks on buildings or civilians.
Indeed, Allah, God, does not like those who transgress.
But he did have harsh words for the Mubarak government in Egypt, which he called corrupt and oppressive.
They control Egypt with fire and iron. And they control Egypt with a police state and force.
The United States is trying to kick the sheikh out of the country, but he says the land of God is very large.
Tens of nations will receive me.
Radical Muslim Sheik Omar Abdel Rahman resurfaced today, leading a prayer session in Jersey City's Lincoln Park. The embattled cleric celebrating the end of the holy month of Ramadan with about 1,000 followers. Rahman preaches at a local mosque where all of the prime suspects in the World Trade Center bombing worshipped. He is not charged in the blast, but faces deportation on other charges.
While publicly 3 suspects were still being held in connection to the World Trade Center bombing, another Jordanian-born Palestinian appears in the circles.
The federal prison in Lower Manhattan is now holding 5 suspects connected with the World Trade Center bombing. The latest was brought into town in a heavily guarded caravan after he surrendered in Newark. 27-year-old Bilal al-Qaisi pleaded not guilty in a late afternoon court appearance. Federal sources tell us they'd been looking for him for about a week. His lawyer claimed prosecutors failed to link al-Qaisi to either the bombing or the other suspects in custody, but the FBI says differently. The feds say one of the other suspects in this case had Bilal al-Qaisi's American Express credit card on him when he was arrested. The billing address on that credit card led them to a New Jersey apartment where a timing device was discovered linked to the Trade Center bomb. In addition, other witnesses in this case have told federal investigators they saw al-Qaisi repeatedly at the Jersey City rental locker where the bomb's components were allegedly stored. Al-Qaisi is most directly linked with the man in the glasses, Nidal Ayad, the chemical engineer who may have designed the bomb. Earlier in the day, Ayad, Mohamed Salameh, and Ibrahim El-Gabrani, an associate who was accused only of assaulting a federal officer during a search of his home, all entered their not guilty pleas. Ayad's lawyer says his client was swept into all this because he knew the first arrested suspect.
And on the same day that Bilal al-Qaisi turned himself in and was being arraigned, Mahmoud Abu Halima was captured in Egypt and was in the process of being expedited back. It was reported that Abu Halima also had an instructions manual on explosives when he fled the U.S.
But at this moment, there's no obviously unusual security activity here at Stewart Airport. Used to be a former air base a few years ago, but it is believed that the alleged ringleader for the World Trade Center bombing, 33-year-old Mahmoud Abu Halima, is en route airborne and headed here from Egypt. Abu Halima is an Egyptian native who authorities believe fled the United States on March 6th, 2 days after Mohamed Salameh, the first suspect to be arrested, was picked up. Investigators believe Abu Halima went first to Johannesburg, South Africa, then to Egypt, where he was arrested, we're told, in a crackdown on Islamic fundamentalists.
Abu Halima was so brutally tortured through his interrogations by Egyptian authorities that he begged to be handed over to the U.S. authorities as soon as possible, knowing that he would be given humane treatment. When the feds interrogated Mahmoud, they brought to his attention that they even considered him being a suspect to Mustafa Shalaby's murder because red hairs were found on Shalaby's fingernails. Mahmoud also has a younger brother named Mohamed Abu Halima. His pictures are often confused with being Mahmoud, even in current publications and books.
Investigators now believe the man who rents this Woodbridge apartment, number 1811, was a ringleader in the World Trade Center bombing. He is 33-year-old Mahmoud Abu Halima. And yesterday they questioned his brother Mohamed, who lives upstairs in apartment 1812. I tried to question Mohamed as he left the apartment this morning, but he had no interest in talking.
How do you feel about the fact that you're living next door to these people?
Can you imagine? I'm very scared.
Mahmoud Abu Halima was a former chauffeur and bodyguard for Sheik Omar Abdel Rahman, the militant Muslim cleric who preached in Jersey City, New Jersey. The FBI searched Abu Halima's apartment for 10 hours Friday, but would not comment on what they found. Many neighbors told me they had been suspicious about the brothers.
Are you surprised?
No, I'm not surprised. No.
How come?
Well, because he was very strange. His behavior was very strange and very odd.
There was surveillance around here for 2 days. There was surveillance in that, that they're looking after somebody.
Investigators believe Abu Halima fled the country a day or two after the first suspect in the bombing was arrested, although there have been some reported sightings at this apartment complex recently. Neighbors here at the apartment complex say the brothers look so much alike they could be twins. Therefore, no one is absolutely certain whether or not they have seen Mahmoud since the trade tower explosion. Although the FBI did interview Mohamed, no charges have been filed against him.
Other suspects in the circles of the Blind Sheikh and Sayyid Nosair claim that the brother Mohamed Abu Halima attended a training session in Pennsylvania with Yousef testing out his bomb.